If you're African American, Black American, Afro American, you do have African ancestry. I don't hate to tell you this. I love to tell you this because it's the absolute truth. Whoever told you that other stuff, bald-faced lied to you, and I'm sorry you got brainwashed. African Americans have known this from the time we got here on this land, okay? We knew this. We knew we were not indigenous. We knew we were not, quote unquote, Indian, okay? Now I'm getting ready to show you something, right? This may be why you're confused, okay? There were Creek Negro marriages brought Black Indians, okay? So this Creek, this is the indigenous tribe called the Creek Negro. They were marriages, and this brought about something we now know as Black Indians, okay? Now, before I go on, this is not saying that there weren't any brown-skinned people over here before African people came over here, okay? Because there were brown-skinned people over here before African people came over here. But the indigenous people over here were not from Africa, okay? That's why they're called indigenous. All right, so let me continue. The three men are Black Indians of mixed Indian and Black blood. Okay? Yes, Indians had slaves just as whites did. The whites traded slaves to the Indians for Indian land in Alabama and Georgia. So there we see that with some indigenous tribes like the Creek, okay, white people traded enslaved African people to who? The indigenous for what? Land. Okay? Land. That was the exchange. Creek Indians were very fair with their slaves. They treated them kindly. Many Creeks intermarried with Negroes. Here's where you get Black Indians from, right? Black meaning racially Black out of Africa. Okay? Here's where you get it. When the Creeks divided their land into allotments in 1906 in Oklahoma, their former slaves and children and grandchildren of slaves were given what? Equal shares. Equal shares. That means that those children and grandchildren, okay, of formerly enslaved, they were given land. And in this particular case, that was Creek land. Yeah, the Creek Indians gave it to the children and the grandchildren of the enslaved. Yeah. Black Indians and Creek Negroes who never intermarried with the Indians were all given the same allotments as full-blooded Creeks. So when you see Black Indians, those were the biracial ones. Those were the ones of dual heritage. When they say Creek Negroes, that right there means that these were not biracial or dual heritage. They were the Creek Negroes who they accepted into Creek Nation by giving them land. So Black Indians and Creek Negroes. So the African enslaved were then called Creek and given their own land. That didn't change their DNA because they did not have, they were not half indigenous. The Creek Negroes were enslaved Africans, Creek African, meaning that basically they were adopted into, okay? The minister has a vivid recollection of the day the allotments were made. I was a teenager at the time. I can remember when the Indian chiefs commenced to allot the Creek land, the question came up what to do with the Negroes. There was no hesitation, no argument. The chiefs meeting in the old council house counted all of us as Creek Indians. To this day, many families on the Creek tribal rolls are Blacks with no Indian blood or are Black Indians. This is a quote from a Black Indian, a dual heritage. Negro slaves were helpers more than slaves to the Creeks, said the minister, who is revered by blacks and Indians alike throughout Oklahoma. Creek Indians were nomads. They knew nothing about farming when they came to the Indian Territory. It was the blacks who taught them about farming. The blacks built log cabins instead of wigwams and dugouts, and it was the blacks who converted the Creeks to Christianity. They believed in the sun god and moon god before they had slaves. Mr. Davis lamented the lack of knowledge on the part of most Americans, black or white, about black Indians. You won't read it in the history books. And the sad part, most young people don't know about it. I mean, most of our own Creek freedmen kids don't even know about it. Now, that was from a direct dual heritage Black Creek. Okay? An actual dual heritage one. All right? Now, there was another reason. Okay? Here's something else you want to think about. And I'm going to show it to you. Matter of fact, it was hard everywhere in the Americas to keep indigenous enslaved, because they knew how to run away and go back to their what? Their tribe, right? They knew the landscape. Remember, these people were nomadic. They knew where to go, okay? Now, they would trade 3 and 4 and 5 indigenous for one Negro, as they put it in the papers, for one enslaved African. Why? Because the African did not know the landscape, didn't know where to run, and they didn't have their tribal members like back home in Africa, so they were stuck. So it was easier to keep them in bondage. Now you ask, and this goes to the question, well, how come white people didn't enslave African people on the continent of Africa? Well, a certain form of slavery was already going on in Africa, right? And another thing, so when the Europeans came, they didn't know that landscape. They always had help. Always. Okay? Europeans had no freaking idea how to move into the middle of Africa. No, they did not. They had help. One such person I know off the top of my head is Tipu Tip. He was one of the major slave traders, an African slave trader, okay? So they always had help, all right? It's difficult to enslave people who are on their land, which is why Arab slave trade worked. They were taking them off the land, which is why the transatlantic trade slave worked. They were taking African people off the land. You don't have your people no more. Okay? You can't just run off. Run off where? So it was quote unquote easier to do that. Okay? So there's more stuff I could say, but I only got 10 minutes. Okay? But yeah. Back to the point. You have African ancestry. Okay? It was enslaved Phyllis Wheatley, Cujo, Venture Smith. They were directly from Africa. Okay? Yeah.